Across the United States, there are towns that did not slowly fade away. They disappeared almost overnight. One was poisoned by toxic mines. One has been burning underground for more than 60 years. And one now sits at the bottom of a lake. Here are 10 American towns that disaster erased. Number 10, Thurmond, West Virginia. Tucked deep inside the rugged hills of West Virginia, along a narrow bend of the New River, sits a town that once pulsed with the noise of trains, coal, and gamblers. Today, Thurmond feels like a place time quietly forgot. In the early 1900s, Thurmond was one of the busiest railroad towns in the region. Coal from dozens of nearby mines passed through here every day. The town's depot was so active that, for a time, it reportedly handled more freight revenue than the city of Cincinnati. Hotels, saloons, and banks lined the single main street that ran parallel to the tracks. But Thurmond's prosperity was tied entirely to one industry: coal. When coal production declined and diesel locomotives replaced steam engines in the mid-20th century, the town's importance faded almost overnight. Businesses closed, families moved away, and the once bustling streets fell silent. Today, only a handful of residents remain. The historic buildings still stand, the depot, the bank, the old storefronts, preserved as part of the New River Gorge National Park. Freight trains still rumble through Thurmond several times a day, just as they did a century ago. But now, they pass a town that feels frozen in time, where the echoes of its railroad past are often louder than the voices of the people who still live there. Thurmond faded quietly when the trains stopped coming. But some towns didn't just lose their industry, they lost the foundation that had supported the town for decades. Number 9, Cahawba, Alabama. Hidden along a quiet bend of the Alabama River lie the ruins of a town that was once meant to be the center of an entire state. Cahawba was founded in 1819 as the first capital of Alabama. At the time, it seemed like a perfect choice. The town sat where the Alabama and Cahawba rivers met, making it an important transportation hub for cotton and river trade. Wealthy plantation owners built elegant homes, brick warehouses, and grand public buildings. For a brief moment, Cahawba looked like it might grow into one of the South's great cities. But the location that made Cahawba successful would also seal its fate. The town was built on low river floodplains, and major floods became a constant problem. After just a few years, the state government decided to move the capital to Tuscaloosa, leaving Cahawba struggling to maintain its importance. During the Civil War, the town took on a new role as a Confederate prison camp, holding thousands of Union soldiers. When the war ended, Cahawba briefly revived during the Reconstruction era. But the floods never stopped coming. By the early 1900s, most residents had abandoned the town entirely. Today, Cahawba is preserved as an archaeological park. Brick foundations, old cemeteries, and scattered ruins are slowly being reclaimed by forest. What was once Alabama's capital now survives, mostly as quiet remnants beneath the trees. Cahawba was erased by nature, slowly, flood by flood. But sometimes, a town doesn't disappear because of nature or economics. Sometimes, it vanishes because people are suddenly told to leave. Number 8, Helltown, Ohio. Just outside Cleveland, hidden within the forests of the Cuyahoga Valley, lies a place locals have been talking about for decades. They call it Helltown. The community was once known as Boston Township, a quiet rural area of farms, homes, and small churches scattered through the valley. Families had lived there for generations, surrounded by rolling hills and thick forest. But in the early 1970s, everything changed. The U.S. government began purchasing land throughout the valley to create what would eventually become Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Residents were offered buyouts for their homes, and many families relocated. Houses were left empty, roads were closed, and entire neighborhoods slowly disappeared. As the buildings sat abandoned, rumors began to spread. Some claimed the government had hidden toxic waste dumps deep in the forest. Others whispered about strange cult activity in one of the deserted churches. Over time, the eerie collection of abandoned buildings became known online as Helltown. Most of the stories are exaggerated, but the atmosphere remains unsettling. Today, the forests have largely reclaimed the old town. Hiking trails wind through the valley where homes once stood, and only scattered remnants remain of the community that used to live there. But every so often, the name still resurfaces, a reminder of the strange and sudden disappearance of a quiet town. Some towns fade slowly into legend. Others explode into existence almost overnight and collapse just as quickly. Number 7. Rhyolite, Nevada. On the edge of Death Valley, surrounded by harsh desert and empty mountains, lie the haunting remains of a town that once exploded with wealth almost overnight. Rhyolite was born during the gold rush of 1904. When prospectors discovered rich deposits in the nearby hills, thousands of people rushed into the desert almost immediately. Within just a few years, Rhyolite transformed from a dusty mining camp into a booming town of nearly 5,000 residents. Unlike many rough frontier settlements, Rhyolite had surprisingly modern amenities. There were electric streetlights, concrete sidewalks, a hospital, schools, banks, and even an opera house. Solid stone buildings rose from the desert floor, built with the confidence that the gold boom would last for decades. But the prosperity did not last. By 1907, financial panic shook the nation's economy, and the mines around Rhyolite began producing less gold than expected. Investors pulled out, businesses closed, and people started leaving as quickly as they had arrived. Within only a few years, the once bustling town emptied out. Today, the skeletal remains of Rhyolite still stand in the desert. Crumbling stone walls, an old train depot, and the famous bottle house built from thousands of glass bottles. Against the vast silence of Death Valley, the ruins feel like a monument to one of the fastest boom and bust stories in the American West. Rhyolite went up fast and came down just as fast. But some towns didn't collapse from financial ruin, they were shut down with almost no warning at all. Number 6. Kennecott, Alaska. Deep in the wilderness of southeastern Alaska, surrounded by glaciers and towering mountains, sits one of the most remarkably preserved ghost towns in the United States. Kennecott was built in the early 1900s after prospectors discovered incredibly rich copper deposits in the nearby mountains. The mines turned out to be some of the most productive copper sources ever found in North America. Almost overnight, a full industrial town appeared in this remote valley. At its peak, Kennecott was a bustling company town with hundreds of workers and their families. There were schools, a hospital, a recreation hall, and rows of wooden buildings stacked against the steep mountain slopes. Massive red mill buildings processed thousands of tons of copper ore, which were then shipped out by rail across Alaska's rugged landscape. For nearly 3 decades, the operation produced enormous wealth. But by the late 1930s, the richest copper veins were nearly exhausted. In 1938, the mining company made a sudden decision to shut everything down. Workers were given short notice, trains carried away the last loads of equipment, and the town was abandoned almost overnight. Today, Kennecott still stands in the shadow of the Wrangell Mountains. Many of the towering wooden mill buildings remain intact, rising above the valley like relics of an industrial age that briefly thrived in one of the most remote places on Earth. Kennecott was abandoned quickly, but peacefully. The next town was not so lucky. In Dawson, the ground itself turned against the people who lived there. Number 5. Dawson, New Mexico. At the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in northeastern New Mexico lies the quiet remains of a town that once depended entirely on coal. Dawson was founded in the early 1900s as a classic company town built to support the nearby coal mines operated by the Dawson Fuel Company. At its peak, more than 9,000 people lived here. Rows of homes, schools, a hospital, and a busy commercial district filled the valley, creating a thriving community in what had once been open prairie. But Dawson's prosperity came with a dangerous cost. Coal mining was the town's lifeline, and also its greatest risk. In 1913, disaster struck when an underground explosion ripped through one of the mines, killing 263 miners. It remains one of the deadliest mining disasters in American history. 7 years later, tragedy struck again. Another explosion in 1923 killed over 120 workers, sending shockwaves through the community. Although the town continued operating for several decades, the mines eventually began to decline. By the early 1950s, the coal seams were nearly exhausted, and the company shut everything down. Almost overnight, Dawson disappeared. Today, very little remains of the once busy mining town. The most visible reminder is a vast cemetery on a nearby hillside, where rows of white crosses mark the graves of the miners who lost their lives beneath the earth. Dawson lost its people to explosions and exhaustion. But the next town lost something even more dangerous. It lost its ground. Number 4. Bodie, California. High in the mountains of eastern California sits one of the most famous ghost towns in the American West. Bodie began as a small mining camp after gold was discovered in the surrounding hills in the late 1800s. Within a few years, Thousands of prospectors flooded into the remote valley hoping to strike it rich. By the late 19th century, Bodie had grown into a rough and bustling boomtown with nearly 10,000 residents. The town had dozens of saloons, gambling halls, hotels, and businesses lining its dusty streets. Bodie quickly gained a reputation for being wild and lawless. Shootouts, robberies, and sudden fortunes were all part of daily life in the town's chaotic early years. But like many mining towns of the era, Bodie's prosperity depended entirely on the gold beneath its hills. As the richest veins began to run dry in the early 20th century, mining operations slowed. Businesses closed, families moved away, and the once crowded streets gradually emptied. Several fires also destroyed large portions of the town over the years, leaving many buildings abandoned and partially ruined. Today, Bodie is preserved as a California State Historic Park. More than 100 structures still stand, maintained in what officials call a state of arrested decay. Walking through the silent streets, visitors can still peer through dusty windows into homes and shops that look almost exactly as they did when the last residents left decades ago. Bodie is a relic, preserved and still. But the next two towns did not just stop. They are still in the process of being destroyed right now as you watch this. Number 3, Picher, Oklahoma. In the far northeastern corner of Oklahoma lies the remains of a town that was once one of the most productive mining centers in the country. Picher grew rapidly in the early 1900s after enormous deposits of lead and zinc were discovered beneath the land. Mines spread across the region, and thousands of workers moved in to take advantage of the booming industry. For decades, Picher helped supply much of the lead used by the United States, especially during World War I and World War II. But the mining left behind something far more dangerous than empty tunnels. After the mines shut down in the 1960s and 70s, enormous piles of toxic mining waste, known locally as chat, were left scattered across the landscape. Over time, scientists discovered that lead contamination in the soil and dust had become a serious health hazard, especially for children living in the town. In the 1980s, the federal government declared the area part of a massive environmental cleanup project known as the Tar Creek Superfund site. Then disaster struck again. In 2008, a powerful tornado tore directly through Picher, damaging much of what remained of the town. Soon afterward, the government began buying out the remaining residents and relocating them elsewhere. Today, Picher is almost entirely abandoned. Streets lead past empty lots, collapsed houses, and towering gray chat piles that still rise above the prairie like artificial mountains, a toxic landscape that will take generations to fully clean up. Picher was poisoned slowly, then finished by a tornado. But in Centralia, the destruction is quieter and in many ways more unsettling. Number 2, Centralia, Pennsylvania. Beneath the quiet streets of Centralia, Pennsylvania, a fire has been burning for more than half a century. The town was founded in the 1800s as a coal mining community in the hills of eastern Pennsylvania. For decades, Centralia was a typical small American town. Families lived in modest homes, children attended the local school, and the surrounding mines provided steady work for much of the population. Everything changed in 1962. That year, a fire started in a landfill on the edge of town. What seemed like a small, manageable blaze spread into a network of abandoned coal mines beneath Centralia. Once the fire reached the underground coal seams, it began to travel through the tunnels far below the surface. And it never stopped. Over time, dangerous gases began leaking through cracks in the ground. In some places, the earth grew hot enough to melt asphalt and send smoke rising from the streets. Scientists warned that the fire could continue burning for hundreds of years. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the government relocated most of Centralia's residents and demolished many of the homes. Today, only a handful of people still live there. Empty roads wind through grassy fields where neighborhoods once stood, while faint smoke sometimes rises from the hillsides, a reminder that the fire below is still slowly burning. The town is gone, but what destroyed it is still down there. Centralia is being erased from beneath. But our final entry involves towns that were not destroyed by accident. They were deliberately hidden from view, buried under millions of gallons of water. Number 1, the towns beneath the lakes. Not all lost towns in America are abandoned on land. Some are hidden beneath the surface of the water. Across the United States, entire communities were intentionally flooded during the 20th century to make way for reservoirs and dams. As growing cities needed reliable water supplies and hydroelectric power, engineers built massive dams that transformed valleys into lakes and erased the towns that once stood there. Before the water arrived, residents were forced to relocate. Homes were dismantled or destroyed, roads disappeared, and churches, schools, and cemeteries were often moved to higher ground. But in many cases, parts of the old towns were simply left behind. Once the dams were completed, the rising water slowly swallowed everything. Today, those towns still exist, just out of sight. In some lakes, when water levels drop during droughts, the remains briefly reappear. Stone foundations, church steeples, and fragments of old streets emerge from the mud, offering a haunting glimpse into the communities that once lived there. Beneath calm, quiet water, the outlines of entire neighborhoods still rest on the lakebed, silent reminders of towns that did not slowly fade away, but were deliberately submerged and forgotten.